I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Chris Peterson.
What they did was they asked Biden voters and Trump voters what they wanted the other side to know about them. And I read through like 100 of these responses, and I found them fascinating because what you get from it are two very authentic points of view, people who basically see the world differently. And yet they weren't being angry, they weren't being, accusatory. They were just expressing how they thought the world was. And I thought to myself immediately, I was like, well, if these two groups see the world so differently, how can this not affect what people buy?
Chris Peterson is the co-founder of Lifemind, an AI agent platform designed for national, local, and regional marketers. With over 30 years as a marketing pioneer and entrepreneur, Chris has founded 2 digital marketing agencies working with both fast-growth startups and Fortune 500 companies. In the 90s, he launched one of the first digital direct marketing agencies, earning recognition from the Wall Street Journal. Publicis later acquired the agency. Chris later established an early content marketing agency, which was then acquired by Rain. My interview with Chris Peterson is coming right up. But first...
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more to reach the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. Plus, with 1 billion members on LinkedIn, that means you'll have access to 130 million decision makers and 10 million C-level executives. That's a lot of millions of the right people. Get started today and see how you can reach the right buyers with LinkedIn's enhanced targeting tools. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply.
When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower-cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the U.S. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IP-workswonders.
Chris Peterson, welcome to On Brand.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
So I am excited to chat with you because your new book is one that fascinates me. And every now and then I am booking guests and having conversations with other marketers, either at events that I speak at or in the classes that I teach. And that was the case recently, where I was having a conversation with a student about the recent Target issue. And there was really a question of, well, what should Target do around, those that are boycotting? And I feel like it was right around the time that I was booking you with your new book on red customers, blue customers. And I kind of punted in my answer to the student because I said, you know what? I'm having a really good conversation about this in a couple of weeks. And I wanted to use that as kind of our way in. So when we look at what is an increasingly changing landscape and polarized customer bases, looking at Target, where do you go when you are Target?
Yeah, so Target's such an interesting case. I'm glad you brought it up. So Target, when I evaluate brands as it relates to, liberal and conservative attitudes, I tend to first go to how a brand was founded. Okay, and Target was founded in, Minneapolis. I think it was called Dalton's, I believe, if I have that name right, and it comes from a very democratic family, very liberal family. One of the family members was governor, I think, of Minnesota. And they've always been a very progressive brand. And when they rebranded themselves, what was it, a couple decades ago, they became very modern. They became, it was a complete makeover of their brand. And so when you see things like that, you immediately sense that a brand is projecting liberal values. Okay. I mean, you can't, it's not a conspiracy. It's just human nature. It's kind of it's their roots. It's how they were founded. And, and it's just, they're surrounded by, this type of thinking, even in their headquarters. So then, okay, now look at their retail footprint. Okay. And we've actually analyzed their retail footprint as well as a lot of other large retailers. And Target's retail footprint is 70% in more liberal areas and 30% in more conservative areas. So what happens with a company like Target is they've got this fairly clear liberal value projection, which works perfectly fine on 70% of their retail footprint, but maybe less so on the other 30%. And I don't know that they're really aware of this because companies don't think this way. They don't really look through this lens of like, how is my distribution? Who are my customers? How do I segment them this way? So what do they do? Well, I think what a brand like that has to do is, first of all, know exactly what the customer mix is between liberal and conservative, and it's not hard to do. Understand if you're a retailer, what the ratio is in terms of retail footprint, and then have some perhaps extra sensitivity to a segment of your retail stores that may not, from a values perspective, align with your core brand in the 70% that may be in more liberal areas. And it's only when there's backlash, like a boycott or a petition, does this rear its head, when in fact you can proactively manage this. You just have to get the topic on the table. You have to talk about it in a dispassionate way without judgment. And in order to understand what can happen, because similar things have happened with McDonald's through their franchisees. It's happened with a few other brands. It's not typical. I don't think most companies have to worry about that. But when you're a big brand like Target, yes, you do.
So, fascinating snapshot of what is a tricky situation there. How did you first, with your career in marketing and at the forefront of digital direct technology, how did you arrive at this interesting inflection point of this link between political ideology and consumer behavior?
Yeah, so it hit me over the head a few years ago. It was actually December 2020, and I'm a bit of a research junkie. Okay, and I've always loved to research. I look at research instead of watching a lot of TV, perhaps, but it was December 2020. It was right after Joe Biden got elected. And there was a piece of research put out by Pew. And the Pew research was fascinating to me because it wasn't a typical piece of research. What they did was they asked Biden voters and Trump voters what they wanted the other side to know about them. And it was open-ended. Okay, it wasn't like multiple choice questions. So it was open-ended. So these people wrote some content, and I read through like 100 of these responses, and I found them fascinating because what you get from it are two very authentic points of view, people who basically see the world differently, okay? And yet they weren't being angry, they weren't being, accusatory, they were just expressing how they thought the world was. And I thought to myself immediately, it's like, well, if these two groups see the world so differently, how can this not affect what people buy? So I got inspired by that question. I didn't know what the answer was. So I immediately asked myself, okay, do they buy different things? And you don't have to spend much time online to find out that liberals and conservatives consume different media, align with different brands, and buy different products, not exclusively. Okay, it's not exclusive, but there's a big enough trend there for marketers to pay attention to. And then the question became, okay, then I thought, okay, that's kind of the business case. Okay, so there's something there. And then I asked myself, how do you put this into action? Like, what are the values that people use in order to form purchase decisions as it relates to someone's worldview as liberal or conservative. And I thought, well, if I come up with, maybe I could come up with 5 or 7 that would be interesting. And I ended up coming up with 27. And I find these things in a lot of academic research in social anthropology, cultural geography, and social psychology. And a lot of it's buried in these academic studies. And I had to kind of plow through them. And I'm like, oh my God, there's so much here. Research around how people shop for food, how different empathies are for the different groups. And so I kept running into more and more and more. And I thought, wow, why didn't I know this before? I've been in the business for decades. And then I set out to create kind of a roadmap for how to apply the ideas. So it was kind of, on the one hand, it was kind of embarrassing that I'd never applied this before in all the years I've been in the business, but it was so exciting to find something strategic that is new. And that is really difficult these days.
Well, and it is interesting, and like you said, of missing it, but I feel like you're not alone, because most businesses aren't considering this whole, like you said, category, area of research that is readily available, considering that in their marketing strategy. Why are we missing that? It's an incredible input.
Yeah, it is. And I thought about that in the research. And there were so many things that came to me during the research. It was so much fun. There are 2 reasons that I think that that now is the time to look at this and why this kind of snuck up on us. One is that the 2 markets have effectively snapped into place over the last 20 years. And there's a whole history behind that, which I don't need to go into. But, digitization of media has really fueled polarization. You look at it in the news media, on social media, and also even the politicians themselves in raising funds on digital media has really amplified the separation. So the 2 markets have snapped into place. But the second one that's even more interesting, the second reason, is that it feels like politics, right? And so people don't want to touch politics. So the way you get around that is you don't dodge it. You say, well, actually, what this is fundamentally about is worldview. And a worldview is defined as how people see the world and what they believe to be true. And worldview as liberal or conservative takes it out of the political realm. And you can just see politics, Democrat, Republican, as an expression of worldview. So politics doesn't drive people's purchase decisions. It's their worldview that does, and their alignment with different brands. So that makes it a much more easy way to talk about, put on the table, discuss. And, if you have pressure to grow in your business, it's a great set of insights, and applying them is additive to what you already know about your customers. And it doesn't cost anymore, because it's part of strategy, right?
So is there a way to apply these insights without alienating one side or another? Because I think, like you said, the big reason why we've avoided it is it codes as politics. And we don't want to, we think that that's bad, and that engaging even with the insights, with the data, will make us as a brand more political, and thus alienate, as people commonly toss around, 50% of the market. So how do you do the work without alienating
without upsetting
aftermarket?
anyone, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's a misconception that if you don't engage with the topic, that you're neutral. And it's not true. I've yet to see a brand or a customer database that was perfectly neutral or perfectly split 50-50. It doesn't exist. And so what this is really about is putting the topic on the table so you can look at it and talk about it. So like I've looked at, I don't know how many runs of customer databases through this kind of lens. And there's always a skew toward one group or the other. It may be a small skew or maybe a very large skew. And sometimes it's a surprise to the company and sometimes it's not. But they even if they're aware of it, they don't know what to do with it, right? So to your question about how do you do this, without upsetting anyone, right? Well, The way you do that is through worldview and through values. So what do I mean by values? I mean things like, how you think about innovation versus reliability, self-expression versus self-moderation, how you frame up winning. Is it about interdependence or is it about self-responsibility? It's ideas that form a worldview. They have nothing to do with politics. So I'll give you an anecdote that really I enjoyed while I was researching the book. I was talking to my accountant at tax time, and I was explaining to him what I was up to. And I was telling him about a Super Bowl ad from WeatherTech, the company that makes the rubber car mats. And they've been on the Super Bowl for quite a number of years. And I was struck by them because they were one of the few that had overtly conservative themes, but not politics. It's just conservative themes. And I was explaining it to my liberal accountant. And I said, they use these militaristic images, people dropping out of helicopters, installing mats in a suburban car, and everybody's happy. And he said to me, I remember that ad. And I remember thinking, it wasn't for me. And to me, that expression of it's not for me captures what happens when your brand doesn't align with one group or the other. It just fades into the background. It doesn't make anyone mad. The ad didn't make him angry. It just became less relevant. There was less engagement in the spot. And then I said to him, Rick, I said, but you own a car, don't you? He goes, yeah, I own a Subaru. And I said, of course you do. Being the liberal accountant that he is. So, yeah, a lot of it is, most of this goes unnoticed because if it doesn't resonate with you, it just goes away.
On Brand, we'll be right back after this.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more to reach the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. Plus, with 1 billion members on LinkedIn, that means you'll have access to 130 million decision makers and 10 million C-level executives. That's a lot of millions of the right people. Get started today and see how you can reach the right buyers with LinkedIn's enhanced targeting tools. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply.
Make your next move with American Express Business Platinum. Enjoy complimentary access to the American Express Global Lounge Collection. And with a welcome offer of 150,000 points after you spend $20,000 on purchases on the card within your first 3 months of membership, your business can soar to new heights. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum. Amex Business Platinum. Built for business by American Express.
Now, back to the show. So in your analysis, did you find, kind of like with the WeatherTech example, surprising examples of brands that lean conservative or liberal?
Well, I did. And so there's one example. I can't name the company, but I can tell you the details behind it. So it was a women's shoe company. And if you look at the website and if you look at the communications, it all feels quite liberal. The lens, the design, everything about it. The retail footprint, they have 3 retail stores, one in Seattle, one in San Francisco, and one in New York. And I was able to look at the profile of their customer database, and it skewed heavily conservative. And I think it's because they sell a lot direct, they sell a lot online. So it's not just selling through retail. And it really did surprise me. And I was like, okay, there's definitely a kind of a mismatch here of the brand with who's actually buying, which is an interesting situation. You don't always run into that. And what was even better was the database readout that I got was from one of the big database software companies. And they summarized the customer, and they used income, gender, and some other factors. And over in the corner of the report was the worldview, liberal, conservative. It might have been Democrat, Republican, right? But they didn't even factor that into the overview, because that stuff was more if they sold the software to a political campaign, right? And I just started pointing over there saying, no, wait a minute, that's the most interesting piece. And so there was a disconnect, which becomes opportunity, quite honestly, because where you can find gaps in alignment is business opportunity if you're willing to entertain the topic. Okay.
You've said the word, you've talked about kind of lowercase w, worldview, but you talk in your work a lot about a capital W, capital B, worldview brief. And
Yes.
What is a worldview brief, and how can companies use it to improve the decisions that they're making?
So, a worldview brief is the first step toward putting this topic on the table. And it's actually pretty simple. It doesn't replace any other brief. It becomes kind of a filter on thinking about brand, thinking about marketing. And the first step is just look at your customers. What's the ratio of liberal to conservative? Sometimes a database software will just tell you. You can look at urbanicity, like are my customers in more densely populated urban areas versus exurban and rural. You can look at age. If my customers skew older, it's probably going to be more conservative because there's a march of time that happens with worldview. Or you could even just run a simple survey. And you can just ask your customers in an online survey and just ask them. And the way you would frame it up is you don't give them a middle option, by the way, like I'm neither, because those people actually don't really exist. There's so few of them. So you say, I consider myself to be conservative or somewhat conservative, two different options, liberal or somewhat liberal. And then you just combine the two groups. And it's a very non-confrontational way to find out how your customers skew. Then you look at your market. It's like, okay, well, what about my market? That gets a little trickier, trying to find data around, what your market makeup is with regard to liberal or conservative. And sometimes that takes a little research. Sometimes there's research sitting out there. Again, you can look at urbanicity, different reports. There are a number of different ways to do it. So then you look at, are we aligned with the market? And then you decide, and this is where it gets interesting, is like, well, where's my best business opportunity? Should I align? The default decision is always, well, I want to align with both. I want to be neutral. It's like, well, maybe. And there are ways to do that. But each market would be the 10th largest country in the world. They're both big, great markets. Liberal customers have higher income, but conservative customers have lower cost of living, so they net out having equal spending power. So they are both great markets, okay? And if all you did was focus on one, you can be super successful, okay? And I write in the book about apartments.com versus WeatherTech as two examples. WeatherTech leaning more in the conservative market, apartments.com with Jeff Bloom, all set in the future, being more liberal, and actually apartment renters skew more liberal because they're in higher density population areas. So the worldview brief brings that all together, and you make some simple decisions about, well, where's my opportunity? And then from there, there's a worldview lens where you start assembling the values that make sense for what you should project to that market and how you frame up your communications and possibly reshape your brand. I think how this affects brand is fascinating because it raises the question, does our brand align with one of these two markets today? Is it the best market for business growth? Some may say, well, we're just going to stick with our brand. That's fine. There's no right or wrong answer here. Or do you want to reconstruct your brand? And I realize not everyone's going to want to do this, to be flexible, to have a core brand that is around the values that people share, both groups share, and then provide for some flexibility into the two markets when it comes to projecting different sets of values. Because because brand books, brand definitions often have values baked into them, right? And it's like, well, how do they align with your market? And they tend to be imposed on the market rather than thinking about how the customer's values might affect the perception of the brand, if that makes sense.
How does the Donald Trump element play into consumer and business behavior, and kind of what's ahead, what's to come?
Well, I think with people like Donald Trump and a lot of other politicians, I think what you see is this is going to be obvious. It's like the further polarization of people, and I think what happens in this situation is that the values of liberal versus conservative just sit on the surface so much more. Okay, so you can argue that these values become even more important in times like this, and to understand them, because so your brand doesn't get into trouble, or you can just resonate with the best market. So yeah, they're just more on the surface, and it kind of comes and goes. I mean, give it a year or two, it could be quite different. But I think as long as you have the topic on the table and understand both sides in a way that is, non-judgmental, then you can navigate through this just fine.
So as we come kind of full circle, it kind of almost brings us right back to Target. So as they look at where they're at and that kind of very challenge that you just talked us through, what would be logical next steps? Because I've got to imagine that there's a lot of voices with a lot of ideas on what they should do, how they should do it, because it does seem, based on kind of how you've laid it out, that they might be at odds with what the worldview brief of their customer might be.
Yeah, so I think Target has a couple of options. And these aren't easy things to do, right? Because we're talking about a big company and a big retail footprint. If you look at the retail footprint, okay, 70% in liberal areas, 30% roughly in more conservative areas, they could form a strategy to go more all in on liberal areas, okay? And say, you know what, we're a liberal brand, we have liberal values, we're not pushing politics. They're not, talking about policy. It's just how they express themselves. It's just their human nature, right? Just like conservative brands do. And so one option would be just like, no, let's during these times, let's optimize toward the more liberal market areas. Now, the challenge with that for Target is that it's kind of a bigger box store, which means it has to be in a geographic area that can support the real estate investment in something like that, which is not necessarily the inner city. Okay. So that there's some tension there, right? And I think maybe that 30% more conservative footprint is a result of because they just have to be in places that are just further away from a city in order for their business to be viable. The second option would be to revisit their brand, which is not easy for a big company to do, and say, okay, let's see, how can we appeal more to both groups and not just maybe more like one, so that we can actually grow our business into both geographies. Okay. Both are big decisions, right? This is nothing small. But if you want to look at the long-term growth of Target, I mean, to me, those are fundamentally the two possible ways to go forward as it relates to this topic.
Well, it is, like you said, not something that is an easy item to check off of a list. Well, I have smiled with thoughtfulness at all of the big things that we've talked about, but now it's time to have a little bit of fun and hear about a brand that's made you smile recently, and I won't ask you if it's a red or blue brand either.
Okay. I don't know if it's a red or blue brand. It is funny. You'll see articles like in the Wall Street Journal that have you guess like certain brands if they're, red or blue, which is kind of funny. But they never talk about why they're red or blue, which is really what this topic should be about. But the brand that is, I think, made me smile is New Balance, the shoe company, because I've always thought of them as a really clunky shoe. And I've always liked them because I have a really wide foot, and they're one of the few companies that width sizes, and now they're in style. I can't believe, New Balance is fashionable somehow. I don't know how it happened, but I'll take it, and it makes me smile. So.
That's awesome. Well, I'm also reminded of just a simple smile for those watching via video or video clips of this, that we're here talking about red and blue customers, and without any sort of forethought, both of us have showed up to this interview dressed in black. So we're going with a Johnny Cash worldview here for the podcast.
We're for the people.
Exactly. So where can folks go, Chris, to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so the book Red and Blue Customers, it's available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. The website that I'm associated with, the company that I co-founded, is called Lifemind.ai. And we're building an online platform that helps automate the expression of all these values into marketing and branding. And we're still building the platform, but I would like to offer your listeners something, which would be, we built this database of the United States around all these different values, including liberal and conservative. And if anyone wants a free analysis of their customers as being more liberal or conservative, not far left or far right, but just what the ratio is and what some insights might be, we'll do that because it's pretty easy for us to do. And it doesn't involve any sensitive customer data. It's just a customer account by zip code is all we need. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can go to lifemind.ai /on brand for your listeners. And we'd be happy to, if you're wondering if your customers are more liberal or conservative, then we'll figure it out for you, and it'll be fun. And we're curious to see what kind of companies are interested in learning. So.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to all of that in our show notes too, which folks can find at onbrandpodcast.com. Chris Peterson, thanks for being on brand with us.
All right. Thank you, Nick. It's been fun.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Robbie Samuels hosts the On the Schmooze podcast. Robbie, tell listeners what to expect from the show.
Since 2015, I've interviewed entrepreneurs who overcame challenges to achieve success in their field or industry. Tune in to On the Schmooze to listen as I ask deep questions to elicit untold stories about leadership and networking.
And where can people subscribe?
Find the show at ontheschmooze.com or on marketingpodcast.net, or just search for it wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard them. Go subscribe. This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.